Shabbat Shalom. It's really nice to be back. So many familiar faces. It's just really wonderful, like a homecoming. Thank you, Rabbi Booth. Thank you to Rabbi Graf for the opportunity to talk to you in memory of my father-in-law, Alfred Goldhaber, whom everyone knew as Fred. Many of you knew Fred because he and Susan were big fans of Kol Hamet, dating back to a famous trip to Israel and Turkey that Rabbi Lewis led many years ago, and they would always reminisce about that trip. I also want to say a special thank you to my sister-in-law, Sarah Goldhaber-Fiebert. Sarah put a lot of planning into this Shabbat for quite some time, which is just typical of her extraordinary devotion to her parents. She is an exemplar of Kibud Av V'Em, the mitzvah to honor parents. Fred Goldhaber was a physicist. It's our family business. But towards the end of his career, he collaborated with a philosopher whose name is Robert Crease, first to teach a course, and then later they published a book together about the impact of quantum mechanics on our broader culture. So it's not really a science book, although it does explain the science. It's called The Quantum Moment. If you're interested in quantum mechanics, it's a really good read. So just to give you an example, one of the chapters explores the impact on popular culture of a paper published in 1935 by Erwin Schrödinger. And that paper included a thought experiment, which Schrödinger had intended as kind of a joke. Only later, the joke was taken quite seriously because it demonstrates just how mind-bending quantum mechanics can be. So I'm talking, of course, about the famous Schrödinger cat. We get a meow, thank you. So in case you're not sure what it is, imagine a sealed box with a cat inside. The cat was alive when you saw it go into that box. Also at that time, it had a sealed vial of poisonous gas. The box also contains a very small amount of radioactive material, so small that within the course of an hour, there's about a 50% chance one atom could decay and release a particle, or equal chance that nothing happens. Also, the box contains a very sensitive Geiger counter, a device that's designed to measure radioactivity. And the Geiger counter has been jerry-rigged to be attached to a hammer, so that if the Geiger counter detects a particle, it will release that hammer and smash the vial of gas, and of course, the cat dies. But if no particles are released, the Geiger counter has nothing to detect, the hammer stays as it is, and the cat lives. So this was a joke, because obviously a cat cannot be both dead and alive. And since that's true, the particle that would have caused it to die seems like it cannot be both released from its atom and bound to its atom at the same time, right? It has to be in one state or another. So this is, to be clear, a quantum mechanical particle we're talking about, perhaps an electron. Far too small for us to actually see, probably to fully comprehend, and it's 1935, the early days of quantum mechanics. So at that time, Schrödinger, like Einstein, rejected what is now considered fundamental. But today, physicists all agree. Quantum mechanical particles do exist in multiple states simultaneously. Until we measure its state, that particle is both bound to the atom and not bound to it. So, what about the cat? And every now and then, I try to revisit Schrödinger's puzzle with my personal physics consultant, my husband, David, who, first I'll tell you my reaction. Invariably, after a couple minutes of discussion, I noticed that the register of my voice is getting a little higher, and I'm leaning forward in my seat, and my hands are gesticulating energetically. It's just so darn frustrating. The cat can't be both alive and dead. And my dear, brilliant, unflappable husband, who is quite a bit like his father of blessed memory, responds calmly to each of my questions with totally unsatisfying answers. I wonder if 2,000 years ago, the students of Hillel and Shammai felt the same. What do you mean we can marry the daughters of the other school? They might feed us unkosher food. Worse, we might be marrying someone who's totally forbidden to us because of are our rules for real or for not? And I can just imagine the response, especially from Hillel. Ah, my son, the oven is simultaneously pure and impure. The union is simultaneously permitted and forbidden, and both are the words of the living God. Okay, forgive me if you didn't follow that. Hillel and Shammai were among the founding fathers of rabbinic Judaism. They lived at the time of the Mishnah, which is the very beginning of the Talmud. And they disagreed about every detail of Jewish life. But the students of the two schools did not hesitate to marry each other. And in fact, a heavenly voice once came out to reassure them, this and that, meaning both sides, are the words of the living God. So one of the most challenging aspects of quantum mechanics is the notion that reality is uncertain. And I want you to hear one particular description from my father-in-law's book, comparing kind of classical thinkers like Laplace and Newton to quantum mechanics. Quantum mechanics has helped rid philosophy of a Laplacian ideal of knowledge and of the vision of a unified science, of a too narrow conception of phenomena, and of an impossible objectivity. Our world, unlike that of our ancestors, is full of what Updike calls gaps, inconsistencies, warps, and bubbles. As a result, our novelists and poets have to address a reality whose surface is less like the smooth geometry of the Newtonian world and more like that of a kettle of boiling water. So, end quote. So both Laplace and Newton, who were members of the Christian gentry, were privileged to live in a fairly smooth, self-consistent world. Not so the great thinkers of Judaism. The Talmud, which is the book from which nearly all future Jewish thinking emerged, views reality as far more like Updike's post-quantum world of gaps, inconsistencies, warps, and bubbles. In Talmudic thinking, two plainly contradictory opinions can both be true. And that can be a really difficult reality to inhabit. If I get frustrated thinking about Schrodinger's cat, how much more so in confronting contradictory ideas that directly impact my life? For anyone who loves Torah as I do, this week's Torah portion is a prime example. Kitetse includes pieces that are the simple, smooth essence of what we think an eternal Torah should be. Like the example Rabbi Booth gave to introduce the Torah reading, don't avert your eyes, return a lost object if you see one. Or don't subvert the rights of a foreigner. Remember that you were a slave in Egypt. Or don't harvest your crops to completion. Leave anything that you missed during the first sweep for the hungry to come and gather. Kitetse also includes pieces that seem to take the rather outdated morality of the ancient world and push it in the right direction, but fall far short of what I would call an eternal ideal. So just to give you one example, you may not execute a child for the crimes of his parents. Good, but why does the Torah view so many offenses as capital crimes? And by the way, this week's Torah portion is the one that prescribes stoning as the punishment for a wayward child. In fact, as you also alluded, Kitese includes quite a few what I would call flatly appalling pieces like that. One of the ones that particularly irks me, if a bridegroom accuses his bride of not having been a virgin, The burden of proof falls on her and her family. And if they can't prove her virginity, the punishment is death by stoning. How? How? This is so far more frustrating than a cat that's both dead and alive. Is the Torah both eternal and not eternal at the same time? Implicitly, the Talmud's answer to that question is yes. We can hold to the Torah as eternal truth and also allow space for humanity to grow and evolve if we engage with Torah through the lens of midrash, the Talmudic method of interpretation. Talmudic law, for example, includes so many restrictions on when and how capital punishment could be applied, it made it practically obsolete. And, this is the critical part, the Talmud does not present these restrictions as extra layers added onto the biblical text after the fact. Instead, the rabbis reread the biblical text so that the restrictions seem to emerge from the text itself. The passage about that non-virgin bride includes another midrashic twist. The Talmud rereads it to make it into a case of adultery. The reinterpretation there was so effective. I can still remember 15 years ago when I was at the conservative yeshiva, and my study partner first pointed out to me that that's not what the original text seems to say. I'd read this passage so many times in my life and I hadn't realized it until he made me read it through very carefully. Now, I still don't like the idea that Judaism views adultery as a capital crime, even theoretically, even with all those rabbinic safeguards against ever actually executing someone. But I have to say, it's a lot better than viewing premarital relations as a capital offense. Warps and inconsistencies. This is how we hold on to our beloved traditions while also creating space for our morality to evolve. We learn to dance with warps and inconsistencies. All of rabbinic Judaism is based on this method of reinterpretation, which is called midrash. The logic of midrash often feels forced to a modern reader, and the ties to the original biblical text are often very flimsy. But out of this midrashic method, the Talmud built an incredible edifice of ritual and civil law. And in a moment of unusual self-disclosure, the Mishnah in Tractate Chagiga describes parts of the endeavor like this, quote, "The laws relating to nidarim, vows, are flying in the air with nothing to support them. The laws of Shabbat, festival offerings, and consecrated property are like mountains suspended by a hair." Compare that Mishnah to an observation in the final chapter of my father-in-law's book, The Quantum Moment. Quote, "The Newtonian world is like a rigid building that floats without a foundation. The quantum world is like a firmly built treehouse connected to the ground but able to sway in the breeze." Now, I find it very unlikely that either Fred or his co-author had ever seen the Mishnah Chagiga, but they came up with such similar imagery because Talmudic thinking predicted our quantum moment by nearly 2,000 years. Perhaps because the Talmud is not just a scholarly document, it's also a guidebook for life. And every human being is full of gaps, inconsistencies, warps, and bubbles. Our spiritual work is to construct ourselves as a firm, reliable treehouse that does not get frustrated with all of life's swirls and contradictions. My father-in-law was such a person. Fred Goldhaber was a clear, solid thinker, but also a flexible one. By the way, his book gives a satisfying answer to the Schrodinger cat paradox, because he was really good at explaining things. But he was also a patient teacher when a student didn't get it, and very accepting of his students' foibles. He was a man of great integrity who also showed respect to every person he encountered. In his memory, may we all be blessed with clear-headed thinking and with the ability to tolerate dissonance. May we be solid in our rejection of injustice and tolerant and patient in our acceptance of one another. Shabbat Shalom.